afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have with us a real treat. Richard Aldous, historian. You are the only person I have ever written fan mail to after having written a book. I read a book of theirs, so I'm very excited that you're here. We're going to talk about that book in a second. I want to go over your bibliography, which is very impressive and has a lot of names I have no idea who they are. So it's
I knew there was going to be a kicker coming somewhere in there.
Well, it's true. I mean, I'm a fairly educated and informed American, but your first book was about Malcolm Sargent. This is not a household name.
Yeah, Malcolm Sargent is one of the great conductors of the 20th century, but he is very much a British figure, very important during the Second World War when he kind of tours with orchestras around not just Britain but goes to neutral countries, follows people like Herbert von Karajan and Furt Wengler, and they do these competing concerts. So he's very much a cultural figure.
In Britain?
Yeah.
Okay, now this one is obviously much more popular here. Macmillan, Eisenhower, and the Cold War. What was that?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the real themes of my work, kind of going right back to when I started out as a historian, that looking at Anglo-American relations. That one is looking at Macmillan and Eisenhower in the immediate aftermath of the Suez Crisis, looking at how they rebuilt the special relationship. And obviously, we're going to be talking a bit later about another special relationship.
Oh yes, Thatcher. We have The Lion and the Unicorn, Disraeli versus Gladstone versus Disraeli.
Yeah, one of my favorite books, actually, not just to write, but just even kind of looking back. I think that, so often politics has got a bad name and we forget that these kind of titanic battles, these great rivalries between huge figures like Gladstone and Disraeli, sometimes we think the Victorians are dusty and dull, and that is so not the case.
They were vicious.
They were vicious. There's a pugilistic quality to their rivalry, but there's also a kind of respect. They know what they're doing, but they also know that in some ways they're never stronger than when they're actually competing with each other. Gladstone is never really the same after Disraeli dies.
Great Irish speeches.
Yeah, it's probably my best-selling book. It was a #1 bestseller. In fact, it was the Christmas #1 in Ireland when I lived in Dublin. The Irish, one of the things that I loved about Dublin is they really loved their history. And so, the fact that a history book could be the #1 bestseller in fiction and non-fiction at Christmas. But I also wrote another book about one of the main Irish entrepreneurs, a guy called Tony Ryan, who anyone who's traveled in Europe will know the airline Ryanair. It's one of the most amazing business stories in all European history, to go from nothing to creating this airline, which is now the kind of 5th or 6th biggest in the world by passenger numbers. An astonishing story.
I have a great story to tell you about this, about Ireland. I was born in the Soviet Union, so I am painfully aware of how Europeans view Americans, and often accurately, with very ignorant and insular. I was doing an interview with the Irish Echo in 2008, and being a professional troll, I played into these ideas. And the woman gets on the phone with me, and I go, I'm so honored. And I played it straight. I said, I'm so honored to be on the phone with the Irish Echo. Margaret Thatcher is such a hero of mine. And she thought this is a stupid American who thinks we're all the same. And there's this awkward pause. And she goes, well, right, we're not going to talk about that. And she just moved on. And it was so much.
Yeah, I mean, Margaret Thatcher is a very controversial figure, as you're rightly saying. One of the really interesting things, actually, that comes out of Charles Moore's the third volume of Charles Moore's biography, which I know that you're reading at the moment, and which I've read too, is that the Irish Taoiseach or Prime Minister, Garret FitzGerald, in that book, he's quoted as saying, actually, we need Margaret Thatcher to win the election in 1987 for Ireland. So in other words, there's a kind of a growing recognition that she was trying to do things with Ireland, with the peace process, but obviously because of what happened in the early 80s with the hunger strikes and so on, that's a legacy which is going to take a long time, even now, I think, to pass away.
So we're airing this episode on New Year's Day week. And the reason is there's this old adage where you should spend New Year's Day doing what you'd want to do for the whole year. So I wanted to have people who I'm excited to talk to. And when I read this book, it really, really moved me. And I want to hear, I can answer this question, but from your perspective, Reagan and Thatcher, the difficult relationship. Why should we, this is a softball, but it's fine.
But softballs are always the worst. You know that.
No, this is not the worst. Why should we care nowadays about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan?
No, I think it's a really interesting question because it's one of the things, but it actually is, but it's one of the things that I notice with my own students, for example, that, I mean, the incoming class at Bard now, not only do they not remember the Cold War, that most of them coming in this year were born after 9/11.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
wow.
it's an astonishing.
Yeah, we're old.
So, in many ways, the Cold War is to that generation, the kind of the rising generation, if you like, is what something like the Second World War was to my generation. So, it is important to kind of go back and look at these things as history now. They're actually not politics, and that gives us an advantage because, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan were characters who divided. In fact, Margaret Thatcher purposely set out to divide during her time. So politically, very controversial, as you were just saying there about Ireland. But now we can go back and we can look at her very much as a historical figure, and that enables us to take a kind of a more rounded view. But the reason why they're important and why it's necessary to kind of go back and look at this relationship is because they were absolutely pivotal in bringing the Cold War to an end. I mean, it's I think one of the things that has really changed in the way that we see Reagan now as historians. Back in the 80s, people used to think that Reagan was kind of almost an idiot in some ways. A joke, yeah, exactly. But there was an old SNL gag or routine that they used to do where Reagan would be doing all kinds of complicated stuff, talking about nuclear weapons and treaties and strategic things, and then an aide would come in and say, Mr. President, Jimmy Stewart is here, and Jimmy Stewart would come in, and Reagan then would go back into his public persona of, shuffling and a bit halting and not really knowing very much and kind of. That's actually pretty close to the truth, that it's quite clear that he has a strategic vision for ending the Cold War that may not have been about the details, but very much was about the big picture. And so I think it is possible for historians now to say that he really was instrumental in bringing about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So, I mean, to my mind, that's a story that matters. Margaret Thatcher was an essential part of that too, not least because she's the person who introduces President Reagan to Mikhail Gorbachev.
One of the things I resent and I castigate the right wing for constantly is the fact that there is this ignorance of what the Cold War was and how bad communism was for those under its clutches, and how heroic it was that this Cold War was ended peacefully without much of any blood loss, as opposed to World War II, World War I, and how half the world was free. And there's very little recognition in the, we talk about the horrors of the past, slavery, Jim Crow, Nazism, but there is precious little, especially in America, I think, understanding of what they were up against.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would say, of course, is that there is considerable loss of life during the Cold War, as well,
yes.
But you're right that it's not the kind of cataclysmic disaster. I mean, how many people die in the Second World War? We don't even know.
It's off the charts.
I mean, it's like, is it 40 million? Is it 60 million? Well,
and it's a percentage too. It's crazy.
So if you're talking about those kind of numbers, that gives you an indication of just how extraordinary the loss of life was, and obviously things like the Holocaust as well, which are kind of part of that. So although the Cold War is not a war where nobody dies, nevertheless it's not on that kind of level. But, of course, we know, and certainly I remember this from kind of growing up during the time, that war is always conducted under the shadow of the bomb.
Yes.
And one of the things that we know about Ronald Reagan is that when the NATO forces were conducting a kind of strategic operation that is, to all intents and purposes, a practice, so a NATO exercise called Able Archer, that there was a stage where the Soviets actually thought this was for real and that maybe this was the beginning of nuclear war. And that really scared Reagan. You know, when Reagan came to understand what had happened through actually a Soviet agent who turned and gave valuable information, he realized that actually, you know, we have to do something to de-escalate what is going on here. And that's why he comes up with the idea of Star Wars, much derided, but nevertheless it came from an instinct of trying to get away from the idea that the world could destroy itself many times over, and crucially that a war like that could begin by accident, not by design.
There was, I forget where I read this, so I'm going to have to give it a certain percentage that I made it up, but I'm 99% sure I read it. Both Reagan and Gorbachev independently were taken down to their respective bunkers and went through the dress rehearsal of, okay, if we're going to press the button, this is how it's going to happen. And both of them independently said, I'm not pressing this button, even in this imaginary scenario. If we're going to get nuked, we're not retaliating.
Yeah.
And that, to have them both go from the JFK Khrushchev brinksmanship to be like, you know, to become pacifists effectively. Millions of our citizens are dying. I don't care. We're not going to destroy the world. That is a beautiful, I think, moment historically.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's one of the, I mean, you referred earlier to the subtitle of my book, The Difficult Relationship. That's one of the difficult moments in that relationship, because when Reagan and Gorbachev go to Reykjavik and come, you know, literally within that amount of effectively deciding there's going to be no more nuclear deterrent, that they're going to give away all of their nuclear weapons. Margaret Thatcher describes that as like an earthquake under her feet. But I mean, in some ways, she could see where he was coming from, and she knew that he had this kind of idealistic streak. But the difference for Britain and for Europe, of course, is that they have all of the Soviet conventional forces waiting on their borders. So if there's no nuclear weapons, then Europe feels that it's very much on the front line of what's going on. But I think you're right. There's something very genuine about the way in which Reagan and Gorbachev discuss these things. And for listeners and viewers who are interested in this, just stick Thatcher Foundation into Google, and you can read the transcripts on the Thatcher Foundation website of the Reykjavik summit, and you can follow the conversation as they both, Reagan and Gorbachev, both come to realize what they are actually saying to each other. Is astonishing. I mean, it leaps up off the page as they begin this conversation. It's slightly testy to begin with, but there's an exchange which, and obviously I'm paraphrasing, but it more or less goes, well, you know, maybe we should just get rid of all of them. Well, maybe we should. Is that what we're actually talking? And you can see them when they realize that actually this is something that we might be able to do. And Reagan says, you know, who knows, maybe in 20 years' time, we'll meet again and we'll be able to kind of stand over the very last nuclear weapon being destroyed. And so, I mean, you know, I think that's one of the great things about actually being a historian. It's one of the things actually that slightly worries me about the digital age, that, you know, you can go back and you can look at these documents. They're there. You can read the transcripts. Although, I guess, without wishing to turn political, we know that transcripts are still very much kind of in the frame of reference today, aren't they? So, you know, maybe these things and these kind of records are still being kept in the same way.
So we're, you know, politicians are very big. You know, we talk about in contemporary times about creating a narrative and branding. Thatcher was painfully aware of this even in the 70s, and she very much wanted to create this impression that we're besties. I'm making she used the phrase, you know, making the United or Britain great again. I can't bear to see Britain in decline. I just can't, you know. So she wanted to make sure she's the first one invited to Reagan's White House. Look at us, we're pals. But when she first met him, she did not have a very good impression of him.
Well, I think there are two things to say there. That first of all, that it is absolutely true that her relationship with Reagan is about, a lot of it is about affection, and there's never really that kind of meeting of minds that you get, say, with Gorbachev.
Yeah.
You know, when Gorbachev and Thatcher are kind of going backwards and forwards in their conversations, I mean, it's a real meeting of minds, and two people who just love debating, you know, coming from very different perspectives. That's not really what happens with Reagan. Nevertheless, when you go back and you look into the... actually, you can trace it back into the 60s when Reagan came to the UK and gave public speeches. Her husband, Margaret Thatcher's husband, Dennis, went and heard him and brought some of the material back. So she was aware of him from a very early stage, and she was very shrewd, because when she was the leader of the opposition, elected in 1975, even before Reagan was likely to become president, she kind of, when he came to London, she made sure that she saw him, and there was, in some ways, a kind of intellectual revolution that was going on in the 70s that they were symbolic of, participating in, but was a much broader discussion. And so you would get think tanks in London, very much in contact with think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, for example, and AEI and so on. So there was a real transatlantic sharing of ideas that kind of tapped into the ideas of people like Hayek and Milton Friedman and so on. So, I think that you're absolutely right that there was not that kind of intellectual engagement that there was with Gorbachev. Nevertheless, this was something very real. It wasn't just about realpolitik on her part.
But I don't remember if it was your book or it was Charles Moore's biography, where she met him and she just turns to her aide. She goes, "There's no one there." And she was kind of taken aback because she had seen him as a fellow traveler. And of course, much later, she developed an enormous amount of respect and affection for him. Speaking as a historian, what do you think is the one thing people get wrong the most about Margaret Thatcher?
I think the one thing that people always get wrong about Margaret Thatcher is the way in which she uses her femininity. That Spitting Image, which was a kind of a well-known satirical cartoon show with puppets, always used to depict her as a man. It's kind of literally in a kind of man suit, which is, when you think about it, it's pretty patronizing. Yes. But she knew how to use that. Douglas Hurd, who was the foreign secretary, kind of tells a very funny story about how they would all gather outside the cabinet room before a meeting. She would already be in the room, and they'd be standing outside, and they'd say, "Well, you've really got to tell her about this. We've got to get this changed. We've got to stand up to her, kind of on this occasion." And they'd say, "Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely." And then they would kind of file in, and then as kind of Hurd tells the story, Thatcher would kind of go up to whoever, as they were kind of filing in to the relevant person. She'd just put her kind of hand on the shoulder and just say, "You're not cross with me, are you?"
Wow, yeah.
And of course, it's the way that Hurd kind of tells it, he would kind of say, "And of course he melted silly arse."
Yeah. And I forget who it was. I want to say it's Christopher Hitchens, but I'm probably getting it wrong. How when she was first leader of the Conservatives and looked at as this kind of curiosity or an historical accident, he was making some flirty comment with her, and she kind of lightly spanked him. And they were like, "Oh, this woman knows what she's doing." And it was this big epiphany that she's aware of her unique role as a woman and is self-aware of presenting herself. And that was because it was one of the ways that she initially came to power, that she couldn't get a seat. There's a very nice film made about this called The Long Walk to Finchley, but she couldn't get a seat. But one of the ways that she realized that she had to lean into her femininity, had to lean into being a woman, kind of take advantage of those things that she was able to do. For example, the fact that many of her cabinet colleagues and kind of other politicians felt that they had to have a kind of a courtly kind of side to them, and that they couldn't, or for example, they couldn't argue with her or shout at her or do any of these kind of things. She played on that. So she shouted at them, she bullied them, knowing that their kind of like misplaced gentlemanly qualities wouldn't allow them to kind of push back. So she kind of neutered them. Hey guys, Michael Malice here. Let me tell you about one of our sponsors. That's Wix, W-I-X. What do? They build websites for clients. If you go to wix.com/welcome, you can learn more. Or if you go to letthatbeyourwelcome.com, you can see the website we made using Wix technology. It was really easy. So with Wix, you can harness the latest web technology and innovative design tools to deliver professional results. You start with a blank page. You design the layout you want. You can get a custom online store. You can get a booking system, live chat. You can publish in a click and make edits fast. If you know how to use some basic what's the term for it? I already forgot. I don't even remember the word. What's Microsoft's slide program? Man, I make fun of Joe Biden and I'm having a stroke. PowerPoint. If you know how to use PowerPoint, you know how to use Wix. And I tell everyone, buy your own URL, yourname.com, because otherwise someone like myself will buy it for you. Or if people are Googling you, they're not going to see the information that you want. Go to wix.com, wix.com/welcome, and you can learn more. And then you'll be thanking me for it. Let's get back to the show. I'm going to use a vulgarity because I feel it's necessary.
Although she wouldn't approve.
She would not. And I would get a lecture.
You certainly would.
And I'd have to sit here and smile and nod at yes, Prime Minister. Grenada. He fucked her hard. He did her dirtier than probably anyone else in her life other than Geoffrey Howe, when Geoffrey Howe, who's her deputy prime minister, whatever it was at the time, quit, went on the floor of the House of Commons, denounced her to her face. She had to sit there stoic. And then a couple of weeks later, she was out of the number 10. But with Grenada, that is a horrific betrayal. But
that's politics, isn't it? I mean, that and it's international politics.
Well, let's tell that story, though.
Grenada, just to, I mean, if people don't really remember the Cold War, very few people are going to remember right. Grenada, I suspect. But I mean, what happens in Grenada is that the Americans fear that there's a real Marxist threat in Grenada, and so there's an invasion. But Grenada is a Commonwealth country. The Queen is the head of state of Grenada. And Reagan had given assurances to Margaret Thatcher that, actually we're not going to go in, and if we do go in, then we're going to make sure we give you a heads up and so on. And even when she phoned him, he in fact lied to her on the phone.
What was this, 86, right?
This is 83.
Oh, so they've been friends for a while. This is not someone they just met.
Yeah. So there's a real. There's a real kind of break in the relationship there. Ironically, now, I mean, part of the reason why Reagan does it is because that administration has been leaking like a sieve.
Sure.
And, he just believes that if you tell London, then it kind of inevitably it's going to get out, and he doesn't want that to happen. So, he kind of phones her and he apologizes. And again, viewers and listeners can go on and read the transcript, or at least a rough transcript of that conversation on the Thatcher Foundation website. But what's interesting about it is that it reinforces a point that I make in the book, and that is something that Gorbachev actually used to refer to. It's a quote by the British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston that, there are no permanent friends, there are only permanent interests. And that's an example where, Reagan had to put America's interests first and then try to do a recovery after with Margaret Thatcher. What's interesting from her perspective is that she concluded from that even a power like the United States that Britain couldn't be closer to, that you can't trust large powers, that the United States ultimately will always act in its own interest. And that's part of the reason why then she has this summit meeting of academics at Chequers, people like Archie Brown, actually, who's got a new book coming out on Reagan, Thatcher and Gorbachev next year. And he's there. And basically what she's saying, look, this current generation of Soviet leaders, waste of time. I can't deal with them. Who's the next generation? There must be people coming through. And they identify a couple of people, including Gorbachev, and that's why Gorbachev is invited to London before he's leader of the Soviet Union.
But what I found fascinating about the whole Grenada incident is that she gets off the phone with him, and now she has to go to the House of Commons, and she has to stare down Labour, who are asking her for hours. Fairly. This isn't even being partisan or being political. Did you know that the Queen's sovereign territory was going to be invaded by America? And she has to stand there and tap dance pathetically, because you're asking a blatant, legitimate question, and she has to, not answer it, and that must have been it was an ordeal. I mean, and he put her through this, and she bit the bullet.
And it's one of the big differences between being the president of the United States and being the prime minister. And she actually says this to him that if you're the prime minister, you have to go into the bear pit of the House of Commons. In her case, actually, it was twice a week to answer questions, and then whenever there's a major incident comes up, you then have to go in and you can be there for several hours answering questions from MPs who want to grill you on this. That is, I mean, a kind of mortal combat that an American president doesn't really have to go through because, for example, a president can end a press conference at any time, and it's just not the same as something which is a constitutional duty. So it's a very different kind of politics. And so I think whereas, Reagan could think, well, this is going to be a bit difficult for her to actually then, as you say, go into that. And she rebukes him during the middle of the phone call. At the end of the phone call, she says, well, look, I'd like to stay and chat, but actually I've got to get back to the House of Commons because it's going to be a bit tricky.
Yeah. And I mean, the strength of this woman to, go there and like lie to her. I don't even remember if she was lying or.
Well, you can't lie in the House of Commons. You have to.
That's right. Yes.
You have to find a way to dance around these issues that, presents things in the most favourable light without actually lying. So, it's almost one of the worst things that you can do is to lie to the House of Commons, but then you get dragged back in and have to apologise, and it's all kind of humiliating and kind of so on. But I think that, in some ways, it's one of the lucky things for Margaret Thatcher that, she's operating at a time when the opposition party, the Labour Party, is quite weak during the 1980s. In fact, that's really an understatement. It's only at the end of that decade that they begin that process that then leads to the election of Tony Blair in 1997, very much influenced by Margaret Thatcher, of course.
Oh yeah, when she was asked what her greatest accomplishment was, she said Tony Blair.
Well, that's right, and there's a very nice note from Henry Kissinger that's quoted in the new Charles Moore Volume 3, where Henry Kissinger writes to Margaret Thatcher and says, well, basically this is the testament that the Thatcher revolution has worked. Tony Blair is your legacy. So, I think a lot of people thought that, and Tony Blair himself. And he talks about it in his memoirs, was very influenced by very different kind of objectives, perhaps. But as he says, the thing that he understood from her is that to be successful in politics, you have to have a clarity of thought. You have to be able to cut right to the heart of an issue. And she could do that. And he was able to do it too, although obviously they're on two different wings of the political spectrum.
As I said earlier, I'm a troll, and one of the things I love trolling Republicans with is or conservatives more broadly, is pointing out that Margaret Thatcher was an affirmative action hire. I mean, she was brought into Ed Heath's cabinet because he needed a woman, and he even said, if we get her in here, we're never going to get rid of her.
Yeah, no, I think there's absolutely no question about that he did not rate her. When she was initially kind of brought in, I think she went into her first job as a junior minister in the pensions department, I think it was. And, there was a kind of a sense that she was kind of dutiful, but, not really kind of cabinet material. But yes, this is the 1960s. Edward Heath felt that there had to be a woman. And of course, ultimately, she completely turned the tables on him. She was the only one who was kind of prepared to kind of stand against him. I mean, it was one of the, I don't know about affirmative hire or not, but it was one of the things that her campaign manager kind of used to say, where, when they kind of said, they used to say, kind of those who didn't think that she was up to it, well, what's the point of voting for Margaret Thatcher? She's just Ted Heath in a dress. And Airy Neve, who had escaped from Colditz during the Second World War and subsequently would be blown up by an act of terrorism. But his reply was, no, she's not Ted Heath in a dress. She's Ted Heath with balls.
I have an enormous amount of affection for her, and I think she's a much more interesting personality than Reagan. I think she's much more complex and multifaceted, and there's a little bit of the loon to her. And it comes out sometimes, like with her and Jeffrey Howe, and certain things. Did you watch the Meryl Streep movie?
I did. Lady?
Yes. What'd you think of it?
Well, it's kind of. I think that. I mean, obviously, Meryl Streep is famous for getting these kind of characters bang on in terms of the walk and the accent and kind of all of that kind of thing. Maybe I'm just old fashioned about this kind of thing. I found it actually a bit uncomfortable watching a film about someone's dementia when that person was still actually alive. That's fair. But as I say, maybe I was old-fashioned about that. I think that one of the things I found interesting about the film was that Abby Morgan, the screenwriter, has spoken a little bit about this, that they kind of started off really wanting to write quite an anti-Thatcher film, I think. And then during the process, they clearly came to realise that even though they disagreed with quite a lot of her politics, that she was actually an iconic female figure. And that what she had, that what the kind of the snobbery, the put downs, everything that she'd had to kind of put up with was absolutely astonishing. And so therefore, as I say, that I think by the end they realised that she really is this kind of iconic figure for what she had achieved, not just politically, but also as a woman operating in what hitherto had been a man's world. And again, I mean, to quote Charles Moore, we're both reading it at the moment. As he points out, by the time she went in 1990, she had become a word that meant power.
Yeah.
In a way that really would not have been understood by previous generations.
Well, there's this great quote from hers that I always paraphrase, which is, having power is like being a lady. If you have to tell people you are, you aren't. And something that I will give for conservatives, the BBC, which she was not a particular fan of, to say the least, they did a 3-part series on her called The Downing Street Years, where they interviewed her and everybody else. And what year was it when she sacked half her cabinet? 81 or 83? It was one of those.
Yeah. So I mean, kind of 81 is that's the kind of the winter of discontent, and that's when she gets rid of a lot of the Wets immediately after that.
So you have these. It's like Disney. Because
did I say the winter of discontent?
Yes.
Sorry, that's completely wrong. No, I mean it's the kind of the summer with the riots, and all of those things.
So you'll have all these former cabinet members. It'll be like Lord whatever, and it'll have Margaret Thatcher cabinet 1979 through 1981, and the thicker their accent, the more, in my view, despicable they are as people. And they'll sit there and they'll be like, oh, when she came to power with this St. Francis of Assisi speech, and where there's confusion, maybe bring certainty. Oh, to hear that from such a creature. And you're sitting there and you're like, they thought genuinely from their class background that she was beneath them, that she's this trash, and how dare you put us in our place. And 20 years later, they still aren't over it.
Yeah, and I mean, you're absolutely right that, I mean, snobbery was a huge kind of factor here. It's also, there's another wonderful British historian called Dominic Sambrook, who's writing this long multi-volume history of Britain, and the volume for 1979 to 82 has just come out, and he makes the point in there, very important, but you don't see it made very often, that people thought that she just wasn't going to survive.
Right.
So, they could treat her in this appalling way with talking about the way that she dressed and the way that she spoke and the way that she walked and all of these kind of things, because they thought, well, actually she's just not going to be around for very long, so we can treat her in this kind of way. And then, once she manages to kind of get through the kind of that particular summer, the economy begins to turn. Then, of course, you have the Falklands War. She's able to turf out all of these people. That having been said, she did have a bit of a soft spot for old Etonians.
Sure,
so,
yes.
The kind of the likes of Nick Ridley. She liked to toff.
Speaking as a historian, what do you think is the one thing people get wrong the most about Margaret Thatcher?
I think if there's one thing that people very often get wrong about Margaret Thatcher, it's the idea that she is just a suburban housewife, someone who would kind of pop round to the local supermarket and be kind of divvying up doing the shopping and worrying about the pounds, pennies, and pounds and pennies, and so on. I mean, she came from relatively modest background, but by the time she gets into politics, her husband is a millionaire businessman. She lives in a kind of beautiful house. She has a nice townhouse in kind of Chelsea. And what this does, in addition to what had been her previous career as a barrister or a lawyer, where she'd been quite successful, it means that there's a kind of financial security that means that she can kind of go out and be a politician, that they can afford to have kind of nannies and kind of people to help with the kind of the children and so on. So it's a very specific kind of experience. But what she was able to do was to tap into that idea of being the grocer's daughter, of having lived above the shop. Those are very real things for her. But sometimes that other side gets forgotten, that there was also a kind of a financial security that enabled her to do the things that mattered to her.
Before she's even leader, there's all these photos of her like in the kitchen and making tea and cooking, and she talked about the whole time. Was this something then that she consciously played up to kind of feed into this image of herself?
Yeah, it's kind of, and some of it was genuine. Sure. I mean, her staff at 10 Downing Street, as you know, the flat or the apartment where the Prime Minister lives is literally above the Prime Minister's office in 10 Downing Street, and her officials and civil servants and so on would always kind of dread the moment when she would say, after they were all kind of working late, "Oh, you must be hungry. I'll whip something up," because they knew that really they'd just much rather be going home, and then if they were done, they were done. But she would head into the kitchen and she would kind of I don't know, whisk up an omelette or take something frozen out of the freezer and kind of so on. So yeah, she did feel that kind of side of things, but as I think it's Charles Pole, her private secretary, kind of says that it was pretty basic, the stuff that she was doing, because for the longest time she'd essentially had a cook and a housekeeper.
Interesting, and who's never pictured in these photos.
That's right. Yeah, very much.
Hey guys, it's the holiday season, and nothing warms my heart more than when I can make someone feel dumb. This ad really speaks to me. If you go to mudwater.com, MUDWTR.com, use promo code DRINKMUD, you get 15% off. What's Mudwater? If you're looking for an alternative to caffeine, to coffee, this is it. It doesn't taste like dirt, even though it's called Mudwater. It's a coffee alternative full of cacao and adaptogens, and it has a lot of magnesium. I always talk about magnesium. The problem is coffee has, on average, 100 milligrams of caffeine. Half the population has trouble metabolizing caffeine. This stuff, Mudwater, tastes like chai and cacao had a healthy baby. It puts you in a good mood, lets you sleep at night without having that jitter and that crash. I stopped drinking Monster. If you go to MUDWTR.com and use promo code DRINKMUD, you get 15% off. And by the way, it's really cool to have in the office, because everyone's like, "What are you drinking there?" I'm like, "Oh, I don't drink coffee. It's Mudwater. You probably haven't heard of it." Yeah, that could be you. Isn't that great? Speaking of being insufferable, let's get back to my show.
I have the perception, and I want to hear if this is accurate, that in the 70s, right, both the parties, the Labour and the Conservatives, were ideologically fairly similar. And, you had those elections during the winter of discontent where it was at Heath, and who was it, Harold Wilson?
So in 70 and 74, it's Heath v. Wilson.
Yeah, so they're going back and forth, basically. They're having all these snap elections, and, nothing's happening. And, she stands in, she tells her prime minister, "I'm going to, run for the prime ministership." And this was regarded as a stalking horse, because she's going to run, she's going to show his vulnerability, and then the real candidate is going to come in and take over the prime ministership, and that
the leadership of the party,
right? The leadership. Yeah. Party. Yeah, they were the minority party then, and that didn't end up happening. And I always thought that her perception of her at the time was that she's somewhat equivalent to a soccer mom here, this suburban housewife kind of figure. and that having her as the leader was almost like stunt casting and like a joke. It's like, okay, we're so desperate for something, we're just going to put someone random in here, which hasn't been done. This isn't necessarily a good thing. She's not some great heavyweight. It's just like, all right, this is kind of wacky, and let's try it out.
Yeah, I mean, she almost comes by the leadership. Well, you could say by accident, because, I mean, she's definitely an accidental leader in the sense that, as you say, she's the only one who stands in the first round. On the other hand, I mean, there's something actually Bismarckian about it, isn't it? That, you know, you catch the hem of history as it sweeps past. And she did that. She was the only one with the guts to challenge Edward Heath. And in some ways, that's something that becomes characteristic of her leadership, that there is a kind of and obviously I say this as a Brit myself, that there's a kind of a British thing that, you know, you really you don't want to offend people, that there's a kind of a sense of good form and being polite and courtesy and all of these kind of things, that and she didn't worry about that. All the others held back because, you know, they knew Ted. You know, Ted was a, you know, good chap, and a good chap doesn't really challenge another good chap. And she was just like, I'm not interested. He needs to go. He's lost, I think he'd lost 3 general elections by that stage. So it's time for him to go. Somebody has to challenge him if nobody else has the courage to do it. And then she had the momentum. There was a sense that because she'd done so much better and she'd forced him out, that that she'd got the wind in her sails. But there's always after that a sense that those others felt that, well, you know, really maybe we better give her one election, but then we're going to get rid of her. So they were always looking to push her out.
And I think it also, in some sense, is on the heels of Gerald Ford, who was an accidental president. In 1974, he steps into the White House despite never having been elected president or vice president. So 3 years later, you know, this rando, wacky lady is now the prime minister. I don't know how we got into this, but I think in some ways it's like Trump. It's like regarded, and I just thought of that just now, like this is a historical accident. You know, basically all these things fell into place, the stars aligned, but we're going to revert to the norm in a few years. So we're just going to ride this out, and then, you know, things will be back to normal. And that, of course, she was the new normal, not them.
Yeah. And, you know, again, coming back to Dominic Sandbrook, you know, that's the point, that it's not just in terms of personality, it's in terms of ideas as well. That, you know, the new political party that is invented, is that the right word, or formed in 1981, the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, by these luminaries of the Labour Party who felt that the hard left had taken over the party. It's astonishing that in their declaration, in the formation of this new party, they don't even refer to Margaret Thatcher.
Right.
So there's a kind of a sense that things will just revert, they will go back to the kind of the centre ground. But as you say, she becomes the new normal. The one thing that I will say, though, is that she was very, very clever at projecting a kind of a very radical view of her politics. And in many cases, she was very radical, but she was also very pragmatic. And she knew how to retreat without appearing to retreat. She also, on things like dealing with the miners, for example, she knew how to say, well, you know, actually, we're just gonna buy them off for this year. But next year, that's when we're going to do the thing. So she was very pragmatic, very tactical, in many ways very cautious, because she knew that she wouldn't have very many opportunities to lose. So if she struck, then she wanted to make absolutely sure that she struck and won.
I think that's a great point, because there's this appearance of her, and she very much projected this as someone who always speaks her mind and always speaks the truth and unvarnished, and that's brazenly false. When she was leader, or maybe a little before, they famously took her and gave her voice lessons, because they did the focus groups, which was kind of a new thing at the time. They said, okay, what don't you like about her? They're like, oh, I can't stand listening to her voice. I'm like, all right. So at the age of however she was, 40s or 50s, she goes and takes voice lessons to deepen her voice. And I don't know if you saw this, there was an interview with her, I think in the late 70s, where they said, your voice changed. And she's like, yeah. And they go, why? She's like, I don't know. And
just as I get older.
It was such a brazen lie. Like, I don't know how my voice changed. It's like, wow. And there was another moment where they were talking about negotiations with Gorbachev. And she just says, look, he's going to cheat. She's like, I would cheat. And so there is this absolute sense of, and you could talk about this heavily in the book, how she was very, very concerned, I think more than him, because she was of the three, Reagan, Gorbachev, and Thatcher, she's by far the weakest of the three, that she has to present something, and especially that air of strength, where she has by far the weakest hand.
Yeah, because, I mean, in some ways, this goes back to the Second World War, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That, that's the moment when, in the derisive phrase, the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States become the big 2.5, that, with Britain being the half. Britain throughout the post-war world, and including during the Thatcher years, is always fighting to make sure that it can be heard at the top table, even if it's no longer quite at the top table. On the other hand, it's been very easy to exaggerate that Britain still has incredible cards to play, that has its permanent seat on the UN Security Council, it has its nuclear deterrent, still has access, it still has its kind of its intelligence services, which are some of the best in the world. So, it's able to deploy those kinds of resources, but it is not the United States, it is not the Soviet Union, so Britain always has to box clever. And she realizes that actually the strategy that she hits upon is that she kind of does effectively a deal with Ronald Reagan. I can tell you whatever I think in private, and I will always support you in public. So, when he's being castigated at summits around the world and during kind of things like Iran-Contra, for example, she goes on the television does all the Sunday shows when she's in Washington, saying what a wonderful president he is. When she disagrees on kind of policy, she very rarely criticizes, although Grenada, that we talked about earlier, is one of the few examples where she does criticize. But by and large, she's supportive. But my goodness, if you read some of the transcripts of their meetings, she just literally flails him alive during these meetings. And the great thing that makes that relationship work is that he is possibly the most thick-skinned president that the United States has ever had.
Well, also look who he's married to.
Yeah, well, maybe
if you go on eBay right now, okay, I was looking at this over the weekend, you can buy a pillbox from the Reagan estate, and on the pillbox is inscribed, "Living well is the best revenge." And you can only imagine Nancy Reagan popping her Valium and thinking of her enemies as she self-medicates. It was just mind-boggling to see. She was no shrinking violet.
Yeah, I mean, she was very, very tough. There's no question about it. But it's interesting when you read the Reagan diaries that you can see how much he depends on Nancy Reagan.
Oh,
actually,
yeah.
There's a genuine love and dependence there, that she gives him a kind of stability. And when he has to go away to kind of meetings and she's not there, he genuinely frets. There's a kind of a touching scene. I think actually it might be when she goes off to the royal wedding to see Charles and Diana kind of get married, and similar things happen at kind of summit meetings. But he's just describing how he's just kind of sitting at home and he's watching the kind of the Sound of Music or something on the kind of the TV, and kind of with his dinner on a tray, and he's sad and lonely without her, because he really genuinely trusts her. So but anyway, I think the point is that he is able to absorb criticism and comment, however strongly it's expressed. And he genuinely seems to admire that. The contrast comes with the first President Bush, Bush 41, when he takes over from Reagan. He was notoriously thin-skinned, and she kind of did the same thing with him. And he was not amused. On one occasion, he just says, "Well, look, I admire her, but she's just got to understand, I'm the president of the United States." Ugh. Well, it comes back to the comment that you made kind of before. If you have to say it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So, Reagan almost never worried about those kind of things. And so it meant that she was always able to speak truth to power. and in the context of the 1980s, the American president, Ronald Reagan, that is the ultimate speaking truth to power, and he values it.
Speaking as a historian, what do you think is the one thing people get wrong the most about Margaret Thatcher?
Yeah, the one thing that people never really know about Margaret Thatcher is that she always used to carry a gun in that famous handbag. I mean, the handbag is now in the Thatcher archives at Churchill College, Cambridge. It's one of the reasons why it's not on public display, because clearly, if there's a loaded revolver in the bag, you can't then just kind of put it out with the rest of the kind of the archival collection and so on.
And people don't also realize that the nickname Iron Lady was in fact given to her by the Soviets. It was not self-appointed. It wasn't Western press. And the reason they got this idea is because she was always packing.
Well, and it's one of the things that did disturb them, that, you know, when she went to, I think it was Chernenko's, there was a lot of comment, but also a lot of respect for the fact that she was packing. That, you know, one of the interesting things about that is that her security guy, who you would have thought would be the one with the gun, actually was carrying a pair of stilettos inside his coat. Because this kind of occurred during the winter. She was wearing kind of big boots, and so when she kind of came inside, she then changed into the kind of the stilettos for the inside part of the occasion.
Hey guys, Malice here. This is an app I really like. It's called Blinkist. Blinkist. If you go to Blinkist.com/Malice, you get 25% off and a free 7-day trial. What is it? What Blinkist does is it takes all the books that everyone's talking about and condenses them down to less than 15 minutes. So you know these books, you don't need to read the whole thing. The point is developed over and over and over. You sit down, in 15 minutes you have enough to have a conversation about it. You want Dale Carnegie, and here's the other thing. If after those 15 minutes, you're like, hey, this book sounds good, you can still get the book. But now you haven't wasted time reading the whole book. So they've got things like both sides. They have how to make people like you in 90 seconds or less, but they also have the subtle art of not giving a fuck. They have The Barefoot Investor. They have Dale Carnegie. How Great Leaders Inspire Everyone to Take Action. All those business books that everyone in Wall Street's reading and they think they're smart, these midwits, that could be you. If you go to Blinkist.com, Blinkist.com, and use /Malice, you get 25% off and a free 7-day trial. Doesn't get better than that, except getting back to the show.
Was this the Grenadiers incident when he's at his cabinet meeting, Thatcher's on the phone, there's that photo of him looking all startled, he gets on and they just hear him say, Margaret, and she's yelling, Margaret, yes, Margaret. And then he hangs up and he goes, isn't she great?
Yeah, that's in fact, I think that he actually puts his hand over the receiver and holds it away, and as you say, isn't she marvelous? And I think that, but I'm pretty sure actually that's when he's giving the briefing to congressional leaders about Grenada. So she's really angry.
Oh yeah, and correctly.
Yeah, she is very, very angry at this stage, and so is giving it to him both barrels. But he, as I say, it's something that he appreciates, and what it means is that when you kind of say the year earlier in something like the Falklands crisis, that's often presented as Argentina invades the Falklands, Britain sends its task force, says to America, will you help? America says, yes, of course we'll help. That's just not how it happened at all. That for Reagan, he was in a difficult position because Argentina was kind of part of his Cold War strategy as well. Galtieri had been brought to Washington, given the red carpet treatment, goes back to Jean Kirkpatrick and her differentiation between an authoritarian regime and a totalitarian regime. So they thought Argentina was important. It was an ally. They didn't want to really get involved in this war between two allies, which is why Al Haig, the Secretary of State, is shuttling backwards and forwards between the two countries to try and avert a full-scale war between these two countries. So, I think the point that I always keep coming back to is that successively you have these major disagreements, but there is an understanding that we can disagree whilst philosophically and strategically coming from the same place, and that, you know, we may disagree about how we're getting from A to B, but, you know, ultimately we all know the direction of travel and the final destination.
There's a great moment in the BBC documentary I mentioned earlier where I think it was Libya that the United States were bombing, and she allowed the U.S. to use British bases, and the other European countries wouldn't. And she's talking, you know, to the interviewer, and she goes, "What's the point of having bases if you don't use them?" And she goes, and, you know, the United States saw that Britain was her right true friend. And then pause. And she goes, "They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know, weak, feeble," and just the contempt coming from her towards Europe. Do you think...
Which I should just interrupt and
please.
say, you know, on one level... is somewhat unfair of her because during the Falklands crisis, she could not have got more help from the French than Britain actually did. I mean, the Mitterrand, the French genuinely were tremendous allies during that war, not least because they had sold military hardware to Argentina, and so they were able to tell the British what was going on, you know, what Argentina had, so that, you know, forewarned is forearmed. So I think that's maybe a good example of where kind of rhetorically she would say one thing because it fits into a particular vision. It also fits into something else that happened, and Charles Moore, again, is very good on this.
Let's explain. Charles Moore is her official biographer.
It's her official biographer.
And Volume 3, the last one, just recently came out.
Has literally just come out. If you want to know what I thought of it, you can read my review in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, I can tell you that I really did think that he did an excellent job, because it's very hard walking that line as an authorized biographer. But, you know, to some degree, you are making the case for the defense.
Sure.
But what I think he does very well is that he makes that case. He refers to her as Mrs. Thatcher throughout, which I think she would have approved of. But he leaves room for other historians to look at what he's saying, to see the evidence that he's presented, and to draw different conclusions. So, you know, for example, my own view of the Reagan and Thatcher relationship would be somewhat different to his. Sure. But, you know, I can read that book and I can see how he's arrived at the argument that he's making. And there's a kind of a sense of conversation, which is what you want with all good history.
But do you think, so there, I mean, on the other hand, there's also, you know, she's a human being. And you have the emotional part of your brain, then you have the logical, you know, part of your brain. And I remember there was this one moment, I think it was in Charles Moore's book, where she had a meeting with, you know, the European leaders, and she turns to her aide and she goes, "Do you know what the problem is with Helmut Kohl? He's a German." And there, these old prejudices, you know, some of you agree with the French proposals, did tend to flare out. And of course, historically, you can understand, given her background, why these things would kind of like validate these kind of old school prejudices.
Well, it's kind of, and it's one of those things, isn't it? I mean, we're all children of our time.
Yes.
That, you know, the Second World War was the defining experience in many ways of it, well, certainly of her younger life. And, you know, I can remember in my childhood, the Second World War was still something that was very, very present, you know, because, you know, I think of my grandparents, for example. You know, one of my grandparents my grandfather was called up in 1918. Kind of did his training, and then the armistice came, so he missed fighting. So, you know, that generation, they went through the First War and then through the Second World War. She's the children of that generation, so it's a child of that generation rather, and so it's kind of very present for her. Harold Macmillan had very similar feelings about the Germans. You know, if you've grown up through the Blitz, if you've seen Nazism, you know, yes, you should be able to tell that post-war Germany is very different. But sometimes emotions and prejudice kind of get tangled up in these kind of things, don't they?
And one of the things
and that gets worse, by the way, as she goes through her term of office.
Oh, yes,
and she deals not particularly well with the reunification of Germany. And then once she's out of power, her views they calcify. She becomes much more strident on European issues because, you know, she's not in power anymore. Right. She doesn't have to compromise the pragmatism that she had during the during the 80s really dissipates.
Well, I think also she resented that both parties had reached this pro-Europe consensus, and she wasn't hearing her alternative perspective being presented, which she thought was the right one. But even if it's not necessarily the right one, how come it's not, in popular discourse, which I think she has somewhat of a point in that regard. The other thing, I'll just talk about World War II. I think I'll give Neville Chamberlain a little more credit than he's due, because I think we forget, having gone through the Great War and the nightmare. And, I don't know if you know this as a historian, plastic surgery was invented as a consequence of all the people coming back from World War I, horribly disfigured and mangled. They try to make them look human again. I mean, it was a nightmare of nightmares. The first time you had industry turn to attack to human flesh. So you can see how, having gone through that, he's like, you know what, we're not doing this again. I don't care. Like, this is just not on the table. And unfortunately, it was on the table. But having survived that, I think in the States, although increasingly, there is little appreciation of what an existential horror World War I was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely for Britain. I mean, there's 900,000 kind of people die, but also, as you rightly say, it's in the way that they die as well. That mechanized warfare, the full resources of the state applied to war, the gassing, the trenches, the kind of the sense of a loss of a generation. It's one of the things that we sometimes forget, that this was a universal experience, the First World War. That the elites are wiped out in exactly the same way as working men. Actually, it's a male war predominantly. Although there kind of many people, many women go as nurses and serve just behind the front lines. But if you look at the son of the Prime Minister dies, Rudyard Kipling's son dies. I think
Teddy Roosevelt's son, Kermit.
Yeah. So the Marquis of Hartington, who is the heir to the Duke of Devonshire, which is the kind of the biggest and most powerful landed estate, aristocratic estate, dies. I think the figures are something like 3 out of 5 of those from Oxford and Cambridge who fought die in the war. So, there really is a sense that kind of right across the board, everybody is affected. And, the mentality, anybody who's been to London, one of the best museums there is the Imperial War Museum. It's a fantastic museum. The Imperial War Museum was created just after the Second World War because they thought that there would need to be a museum so we could remember what war was like, because obviously, having been through that, there'd never be another one. No one would be so stupid as to do this again. So we better make sure we have a museum so that future generations. So, that's the mentality. The irony and the really interesting thing is that it's the generation that doesn't fight. The likes of Neville Chamberlain is a good example, but also people like Rab Butler. They are the appeasers. They are the ones who say we can't get into a war. The generation that did fight politically, the likes of Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, of course Churchill, they are the anti-appeasers. So it's a curious curious psychological and emotional thing going on, that those who actually understood what had been involved in fighting a war like that at first hand recognised that when push comes to shove, you do actually have to make a stand. Whereas those who hadn't fought said, no, we can't do this again. But I think that, in terms of just thinking, it's one of the things that kind of really defines the British experience of the 20th century war. The First War and then the Second World War kind of underpins everything in many ways that happens politically.
Your book brought a tear to my eye. Because how it ends.
It was that bad, was it?
Well, I don't want to say it explicitly. I was trying to be nice. No, but the fact that, they both end up, with Alzheimer's. And the fact that there is, not in Eastern Europe, but in the West and in the States, a sense of thanklessness for what they accomplished with ending the Cold War and freeing half the world. And then to become, in very coarse circumstances, butts of jokes. There's such a sense of no good deed goes unpunished, and there was this it's just very bitter to me. It was just like really unfortunate. You can tell her she's a horrible woman and he's an idiot and ruin the budget, but to just give them the credit for freeing so many people peacefully, and more important, I think also as importantly, because they were regarded as hard right ideologues, there couldn't be criticism from the right that they're being soft on communism. So if this was a leftist who's trying to make deals with Gorbachev, the Republicans or the Tories would be like, oh, you're soft on communism, blah, blah. There was no one to their right. So that gave Gorbachev and them the space to kind of lay down their arms.
Although it is, it is interesting that certainly for Reagan, he does have to be quite courageous in taking on a different element of the right in this policy, because, it's one of the reasons why actually a lot of the neocons who come to power in the second Bush administration are not really very prominent in during the Reagan years. That neoconservatism is not. I would want to be careful about not being turning this into a kind of a complete black and white. But by and large, they are not involved in that kind of administration. But it is true that the kind of the final years for both Reagan with his Alzheimer's, Margaret Thatcher who had dementia, they are kind of.
Wait, that's not the same thing?
They are. Well, I think Alzheimer's is something that you get a very specific diagnosis.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay.
My understanding is that she was, as far as we know, I don't think she was diagnosed specifically with Alzheimer's, although, of course, that's something which is still kind of falls within the bounds of privacy and kind of so on. But, so there is a certain sadness. However, one of the things that I think is quite interesting, and it's happened to Thatcher and to Reagan, is that now that we've stepped back, history, I think, has actually been quite kind to both of them, that they are both seen as being really quite substantial figures in the way that they changed the United States and the UK, that they had a kind of a major influence that was lasting, that they were kind of seen as kind of titanic figures. And that it's interesting that, Margaret Thatcher, for example, Richard Viner makes this point in his book on Thatcher and Thatcherism. Thatcher's Britain, the book is called, that he is somebody who, when he was living through the 80s, was very much on the left. He talks about this in the preface, but that as a professional historian, looking now and using analysis rather than opinion, he's written a book which is actually very sympathetic to Margaret Thatcher and her achievements. And I think something similar has happened with Reagan, and certainly, within it's one of those cliches, isn't it? Obviously there are no Republican primaries, or at least not serious ones this time round. But in 2016, it was almost comical when the question would get asked, who is your favourite president, or who is your, kind of political hero, and you'd go along, and every single person would say Ronald Reagan, because he is seen as kind of being the kind of major conservative figure who not only changed kind of politics and had an impact kind of globally, but also was somebody who did actually reach out to a broader constituency, the Reagan Democrats and so on. And the fact that kind of around the world, there is this kind of sense that, he really did have a profound impact.
Have you read the book, I think it's my favorite history book, Revolution 1989 by Victor Sabetson?
I have, yes.
I mean, it's so beautiful, like how peacefully, this happens. And you have Honecker in Germany, I think is his name. You have Ceausescu in Romania, and they're on the phone with Gorbachev yelling, "Send in the tanks. This is all falling apart."
That's right.
And he goes, "I'm not sending in the tanks." And they go, "You idiot. Like, this is all collapsing before our eyes."
That's right.
They're fleeing the borders. And he goes, "I'm not doing it."
Yeah.
And like overnight, and all these people thought it was a trick. You're like, it can't be this easy. And it was. So it's just such a wonderful book.
Yeah, and what's good about that book is that in a way it acts as a pair with another book that he wrote about 1956.
Yes,
and
the Hungarian Revolution.
So you have this kind of sense that what I think, thinking about both those books together, is that it didn't have to happen like this, that 1989 could have taken another turn. It's one of those things that, it's a mistake that we always make, and that historians always have to kind of guard against, that things look inevitable because they happened. But, you know, we have to, if we kind of go back and think about that phrase that I love, it's by Richard Neustadt and Ernest May, thinking in time, that you have to kind of see the options that were in front of people there in the moment. And precisely as you've described, it ends in this kind of way that is peaceful, but it didn't have to finish like that. The
streets in Prague are cobblestone, so that the tanks would be able, still to this day, so the tanks would be able to, you know, go over them easily. It's just mind-boggling and unfortunate how little this is understood in the West. Richard, we're out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
My favorite part of the interview, I have to say, is talking to somebody who does have that genuine knowledge about the Soviet Union, and that, you know, from your own background, that, you know, I think that there's a kind of a sense that very often these things are seen just simply from an American perspective. And so the fact that you have this kind of much broader perspective, so that when we talk about the Cold War, we can remember that it's a kind of an experience that was very, very complex, but there were real world consequences to the decisions that were made in the 80s.
You are welcome.